The year 1923 is considered to be the major precursor to the landmark adoption of the human rights instrument devoted to children and their rights. As we know, it was a symbolic year, as Professor Waltraud introduced earlier, Eglantyne Jeb and the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. In 1923. Those working with and for children are all very familiar of this important work of Eglantyne Jeb. Most of the international community is, however, not aware that almost in the same year, in a totally different part of the world, a similar movement was being born. Another very similar declaration for children was issued. It was the Declaration for the Rights of the Child, drafted specifically for the celebration of Children's Day, proclaimed that, by our pioneer, Whan. He proclaimed May 1 as Children's Day. As part of this celebration, he published and distributed a document which was later to be known as the basis for children's rights in Korea. Anecdotally, Children's Day has been moved to May 5th after his first celebrations in the 20s and the 30s. This document was constructed in the form of a leaflet and included the following items in it. The purpose of Children's Day, the fundamental conditions of children's movement, letter to adults, and a letter to children. The three commitments for children contained in the fundamental condition for children's movement is considered as the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. It was indeed the first attempt in the history of modern Korea, whereby the rigid hierarchical culture dominated by Confucian Jangyu Yuso, equivalent to Latin Seniores Priores, elder first, was challenged, arguing that children were indeed independent human beings to be honored, respected, and cared for. This presentation will briefly introduce the life and vision of Whan and his contributions to children's rights. Additionally, it will discuss the relationship between Whan's Declaration of the Rights of the Child and human rights in general, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child in particular, hereafter referred to as the CRC. More specifically, the human dignity of the child as envisaged by Whan and the CRC will be discussed. This is a picture of a photograph of Whan. Although Whan lived a relatively short life, he was born in 1899 and he passed away in 1931, his legacy continues to be transmitted today. What is most significant about his work is that the period that he lived and worked in was the most difficult period in the history of modern Korea. Since 1910, Korea was under Japanese colonialism, and its activities were under severe scrutiny and censorship. As an example of strict censorship, publication of his magazine, Audini Japji, he had edited and delayed many times due to the heavy scrutiny and censorship. Moreover, much of his professional activities were monitored by Japan. Despite such hardships, his life was filled with activities solely devoted to children. Introduction to all of his work of Whan goes beyond the scope of this presentation. Therefore, I will mention briefly some of his major works. Whan was a man of many talents, but he is primarily recognized as a pioneer for modern Korean children's literature and children's movement. He translated dozens of children's literature works of other countries into Korean and wrote more than 20 poems, 30-some fairy tales, and many more essays. He devoted most of his time and efforts to elevate the social status of children through numerous events, lectures, and publications. In 1922, he announced that a special day be devoted as Children's Day to recognize the value of children. In addition to literary interests, 방정환 was also very interested in art. More importantly, culture and art were included in his efforts to promote children's movement. In 1928, 방정환 hosted the International Children's Art Exhibition to encourage children to experience different cultures and various forms of art. He believed that it was through art that children can express themselves freely and would foster holistic development. Raising awareness of the importance of children preoccupied 방정환 immensely. The first step he felt necessary was to establish space in which children's issues could be discussed and studied. This preoccupation prompted 방정환 to organize 색동회, a research organization devoted exclusively to children's issues. The publication of 어린이, the first children's magazine, was his attempt to provide space for children themselves as part of his children's movement. It is important to stop a moment to review the term 어린이. It's a Korean term. Until this time, children were called by various pejorative and patronistical terms. In the Korean language, the term for adults is 어른, and the word to be young is 어리다. The new terminology that 방정환 introduced through the title of the magazine illustrated his true belief that children are human beings, with rights just as adults. Therefore, the word 어린이, which translates to young person, implies that children should be honored and respected as human beings who happen to be young, but with equal rights. Let me introduce the vision of 방정환, but before I go into the vision of 방정환, I have to give us a very brief historical context of the period that he lived and worked in. For decades, the Korean society during the Joseon dynasty was under the influence of Confucianism. And earlier this morning, we heard the presentation from Professor Song about Confucianism. Confucianism served to provide rule and order in the society. What characterized the Confucian society was the concept of filial piety and 장유-유서, whereby the younger should respect and give precedence to the elder. During the last years of the Joseon dynasty, a new form of religion was started with Confucian-based Donghak movement. This new religion was Cheondogyeo, literally religion of the heavenly way. It originally started during the peasant revolutions of 1812 to ease the pain of farmers from poverty and exploitation from landlords and the nobility, the Yangban class. Cheondogyeo has its roots in Confucianism, but incorporates elements of Korean nationalism, Taoism, and Buddhism. One of the fundamental doctrines of the religion that is of importance in relation to human rights is that it teaches that all human beings are equal. 방정환 was strongly influenced by the doctrines of Cheondogyeo. He later married one of the daughters of the third patriarch, Yanghee, who is also recognized for his role in the liberation from Japanese rule movement. The social political context in which 방정환's vision was born also warrants brief discussion. The Korean people were faced with a very difficult period when they were put under the Japanese rule. Japanese occupation of Korea actually started with the Ganghwa Treaty in 1876. Through subsequent processes, the Korea-Japan Annexation Treaty of 1910 officially put Korea under the Japanese rule. And this Japanese occupation lasted for 35 years until August 15 of 1945, when Korea was finally, when Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, ending the 35 years of Japanese occupation. Peasant dissatisfaction with the Joseon dynasty, especially with the Yangban class, and the rigid and hierarchical nature of a Confucian-based society laid the perfect climate for various uprisings and movements. In addition, decades of very difficult Japanese occupation mobilized the young and the old to fight for liberation. In essence, nationalism and solidarity were the social atmosphere of the period in which 방정환 lived. During these very difficult and complex periods, 방정환 insisted on protecting children and their rights and took a giant step towards the fulfillment of his vision. This is a picture of Eglantin Jep, which you have here too, and I will not go into details of Eglantin Jep's Geneva Declaration, a precursor to the Geneva Declaration, because it was already presented earlier this morning. But what we need to point out is that there were two very important declarations for children happening at the very same time. As mentioned earlier, the Three Commitments of Children was published in the Fundamental Conditions for Children's movement of the leaflet distributed by 방정환 in 1923. It was included in the first declaration, it was indeed the first declaration of the rights of the child in Korea. This particular declaration was born out of the need to protect children, fully reflecting societal circumstances of the time. The Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child consisted of 5 provisions. Interestingly, the Three Commitments for Children only consisted of 3 provisions that argued for the treatment of children as human beings, equal to adults, and to prevent all forms of labor in order to liberate children from ethical and economic pressures that were socially, culturally, and customarily imposed on children. It also specified obligations of the family and society to guarantee children's education, leisure, and culture. While 방정환's Three Commitments for Children, 어린이 공약 3장, consisted only of 3 provisions, it was more comprehensive than the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child in terms of respecting the integrity of children and emphasizing on cultural and leisure rights. Details of the 3 commitments for children are as below. Liberate the oppressed children governed by conventional ethical standards and allow them to be respected and honored as a human being. Liberate the economically oppressed children and prohibit those under the age of 14 from both paid or unpaid labor. Provide children with comfortable facilities in home and other community facilities so that they may peacefully enjoy learning and playing. I'm going to make connections between the fundamental human rights of children and 방정환's ideas. And I have identified 4 major areas that I'd like to make the references to. The first is non-discrimination and integrity. The first provision of the 3 commitments to children is to liberate the oppressed children governed by conventional ethical standards and allow them to be respected and honored as human beings. 방정환 attempted to change the fundamental traditional view of children as being inferior to adults who are expected to be submissive. He identified innocence of children as something that adults must restore and envisaged that the world would be a place in which adults will share the minds of children and live together with children. he insisted on calling children as 어린이, which marked a paradigm shift of the social status of children. Respecting the child as possessing independent personality and was influenced by human respect and egalitarianism in Cheondogyo religion and Montessori education, which he came across during his study in Japan. The fundamental teachings of Cheondogyo emphasize that people are heaven, which is called Innechon idea. 방정환 even went one step further by arguing that children are heaven. 방정환 further argued that children are not born to be the possession of parents or commodities of existing society. They are born as excellent persons developing unique personalities. Moreover, he emphasized that we must make a child-focused world rather than adult-focused world to bring new life. His emphasis on the independent personality did not stop at being simply declarative, but he provided detailed and specific methods for treating children with integrity. The following are the specific steps that 방정환 outlined for parents in his message to adults. Do not look down on children, but look up to them. Stay close to children and talk to them often. Use respectful, tender language with children. Bathe and cut their hair whenever necessary. Make sure that children have plenty of sleep and exercise. Allow children to take frequent walks. When scolding children, avoid getting angry, but explain to them in detail. Build places and materials where children can gather to play. Always remember that the peripheral nerves of the great universe are not found in the elderly, nor in the youth, but in children. Such recommendations can be interpreted as guidelines for the protection of children from discrimination and to respect them as independent human beings with dignity, which closely resembles the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. More specifically, they closely align with the principle of non-discrimination, Article 1 of CRC, Article 2 of CRC, and Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. While the three commitments for children do not specify grounds for discrimination in detail, he challenged the traditional attitude towards children of the time by recommending that children should be protected from all forms of discrimination due to the simple reason of being young. The second aspect I would like to draw your attention is respect for the dignity of the child. Viewing children as independent individuals is truly a remarkable achievement of 방정환. His efforts to transform the traditional adult-centered society can be witnessed in his movement to use the honorific language when speaking to children. Children, according to 방정환, were not possession of parents, but were individuals with unlimited potential. Moreover, parents and society were obliged to provide the necessary means for children to develop to their maximum potential. Other examples of 방정환's respect for the dignity of the child are illustrated in his message to adults to not look down at children, even when scolding, etc. Long before the international community began to recognize the dignity of human beings in general and children in particular, 방정환 repeatedly stressed the notion of respecting children as individuals who, by virtue of their existence, must be respected and be treated with dignity. This notion clearly predates inclusion of the concept of inherent dignity of human beings in various international human rights instruments. Although human dignity has been an important concept in international human rights law, it has never been defined explicitly. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines dignity as the quality of being worthy of honor or respect. Dignity according to Adorno, is very closely related to respect. Moreover, dignity indicates worth that demands respect. Equality and inherent dignity of all human beings are mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its preamble and Article 1, respectively. By the mid-1980s, the concept of dignity became central to the conceptions of human rights. The United Nations General Assembly declared that new human rights instruments should be drawn upon the basis of inherent dignity and worth of a human person. The first time the Committee on the Rights of the Child officially addressed the concept of the dignity of the child was at the 20th anniversary celebration of the CRC. It specifically stated that, I quote, "The Convention on the Rights of the Child does not include a special article dedicated to the right of dignity, but dignity is a concept which refers to the position of the child who, as a human being, holds rights that must be respected and is cared for, and is the case for other persons." Unfortunately, some point out that clear and detailed interpretation of the inherent dignity of the child is still lacking, although some would argue that its intrinsic meaning needs to be left to various cultural and social factors. CRC refers to the dignity of the child in its preamble and in Articles 23, Children with Disabilities, Article 28, Right to Education, Article 37, Detention, Article 39, Rehabilitation of the Victims, and Article 40 in the Administration of Juvenile Justice. Recommendations for the respect of the dignity of the child are not systematically included in the committee's concluding observations, I'm afraid. Definition of the concept of dignity is only provided in the committee's general comment number 13 on the right of the child to freedom from all forms of violence. The concept of dignity, I quote, requires that every child is recognized, respected, and protected as a rights holder and as a unique and valuable human being with an individual personality, distinct needs, interests, and privacy. The third aspect I'd like to draw attention to is liberation from economic oppression, prohibition of child labor and abuse, which is the second provision in the three commitments for children. Article 32 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is devoted to the protection of children from economic exploitation. It further obliges states parties to provide a minimum age of employment, hours, and conditions of employment, and provisions of sanctions. Whan urged to liberate the economically oppressed children and to prohibit under the age of 14 from labor. It was indeed very detailed specifications regarding children and labor. What is noteworthy is that this provision predates the norm set by the ILO community and the convention, convention number 138 on the minimum age of admission to employment, and our current Labor Standard Act of Korea. If we consider the fact that in the mid-1920s, enrollment rate into the elementary school was only 20%, and 2 to 3% to middle school, a large proportion of children were excluded from education. These children had to take tests to become police officers or had to work as clerks at schools or shops to contribute economically to their family. Considering such circumstances, his argument of prohibition of working under the age of 14 was well ahead of his time. The last aspect is education, leisure, and cultural rights, which is the last provision of Whan's three commitments for children. As a practical measure, he recommended to give children sufficient sleep, sports, walks, and to provide playgrounds and play materials. He regarded children as possessing great artistic talents and that they should be respected accordingly. He argued that as knowledge of self-discipline or morality and mathematics are not enough to be perfect, good persons, children must be stimulated with art. This provision is closely related to Article 31 of CRC, the right to rest and leisure. Whan further recommended to provide children with comfortable places in the home and in the community. He recognized that it was the responsibility of the state, the government, and the society to ensure cultural rights of children. Considering that this particular right was only passively mentioned in the Universal Human Rights Declaration, this third provision of 3 commitments of Whan is considered as being well ahead of its time. In conclusion, more than 90 years have passed since Whan declared the first Children's Day and the 3 commitments for children. Even when compared to any currently existing international human rights norms and standards, this document is truly very remarkably progressive. To date, research on Whan mainly focused on his contributions to modern children's literature and education, youth movement, and the influence of Tonghak movement regarding children. While there have been attempts to re-examine his thoughts and contributions, research examining the relationship with international human rights treaties is still lacking. Although this presentation dealt with only a small portion of Whan's achievements, it is evident that respect for human dignity and human rights of children are not a Western concept, and as presented by Professor Morita, it also started in our neighboring country, Japan, during the same period. Contrary to common understanding, respect for children and their rights predates that of Eglantinjat and League of Nations. More specifically, conditions for full, harmonious, and holistic development have already begun, suggested by Whan, a true pioneer in the promotion and protection of children and their rights in Korea. Thank you very much.